The dirt was still warm under my fingers. I remember that detail more than anything else, the way the soil from my own garden gave way so easily, as though the earth itself had been waiting for me to find what was buried there. My knees ached against the hard ground, my nightgown already ruined, mud smeared up to my elbows, and yet I could not stop. My hands kept digging. 71 years old, alone in the dark at 2 a.m, and I was on all fours in the flower bed I had tended for 43 years, pulling at the dirt like a woman possessed. The neighbors thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had. But what I pulled out of that ground that night, a rusted tin box no bigger than a shoebox, wrapped in an old oilcloth that had mostly rotted away, changed everything I thought I knew about my husband, my marriage, my life, and the woman I had been pretending to be for as long as I could remember. My name is Dorothy May Calloway, and this is the story of what grows in a garden when someone buries secrets deep enough, and what happens when the woman tending that garden finally decides to stop being afraid of what she might find. Hold that image for just a moment, me covered in mud, clutching a tin box to my chest, tears running down my face while the motion sensor light above my back porch clicked on and flooded everything in that cold, white glow. Hold it. Because to understand why I was out there at 2 a.m, digging through 43 years of flower beds, you need to understand where I came from, who I married, and all the years I spent convincing myself that what I could not see could not hurt me. I was wrong about that. Lord, was I wrong. Before I tell you what was inside that box, I need to take you back. Back to a little town in eastern Tennessee called Maynardville. Back to 1952. Back to a 2-room house on a red clay road where a girl named Dorothy May Pruitt grew up believing that a woman's greatest accomplishment was learning to be invisible. I was born on March 14, 1952, the third of 5 children born to Harlan and Beulah Pruitt. My daddy worked at the feed store on weekdays and drank on weekends. My mama cooked, cleaned, prayed, and forgave, in that order, every single week, without variation, without complaint, without ever once asking if there might be another way to live. We were not poor in the way that people meant when they said the word dramatically. We were poor in the quiet, ordinary, grinding way that most families in Union County were poor back then. The kind of poor where you don't think of yourself as poor because everyone around you is the same, and you only understand what you didn't have decades later when you're sitting in a house that finally has central heating and you think about how cold your feet were every winter from October to March. Maynardville was the kind of town where everybody knew your business, where the Baptist church was the social center of the universe, and where a girl who asked too many questions was considered more of a problem than an asset. I asked too many questions. My 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Hamrick, told my mother that I had an excessive curiosity that would not serve me well in life. My mother nodded and thanked her. I remember sitting outside that conversation on the hallway bench, listening through the thin door, and feeling something close to shame, not because I believed Mrs. Hamrick was right, but because my mother did not argue. That was the first lesson I learned about what women were supposed to do with their curiosity: bury it. My older sister Carol was the pretty one. My brother Raymond was the smart one. I was, according to family consensus, the stubborn one, which in our household was not said with affection. I had dark hair that refused to behave, a gap between my front teeth that my mother said made me look tomboyish, and a habit of reading anything I could get my hands on: seed catalogs, the backs of cereal boxes, the one encyclopedia volume we owned, which happened to be the letter G through I. I read that volume so many times I could have told you more about the Gulf Stream and the history of irrigation than any teacher in Union County. School was my escape, but only until 10th grade. When I was 15, my daddy hurt his back at the feed store, and suddenly 2 incomes became necessary. Carol was already working at the sewing factory in Knoxville. Raymond had joined the Army, and that left me. I dropped out of Jefferson County High School on a Tuesday in October of 1967, and I went to work at the Whitaker family's dry goods store on Main Street, where I would spend the next 4 years folding fabric, counting change, and waiting for my life to begin. It was at the Whitaker store that I met Walter Calloway. Walter came into the store on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 1970. He was 24 to my 18, already working at the paper mill in Lansing, and he had a way of talking that I had never encountered in Maynardville, smooth and confident, like a man who had already decided how every room he walked into was going to feel about him. He bought a pair of work gloves, a coil of rope, and 3 yards of canvas fabric. He paid in exact change. He looked me directly in the eyes when he handed over the money, which no man at the store had ever done before, and he said, "You're the Pruitt girl, aren't you? The stubborn one?" I should have been offended. Instead, I laughed. That was the beginning of everything. We courted for 8 months. Walter was attentive in the beginning, not lavish, not romantic in the way of movies, but consistent. He showed up when he said he would. He fixed the hinge on my mother's screen door without being asked. He brought me paperback novels from the Goodwill box at the church because he had noticed I liked to read. These were small things, but in the world I grew up in, small and consistent meant more than grand and unreliable. My mother liked him immediately. My father shook his hand at Thanksgiving and nodded, which, for Harlan Pruitt, was essentially a standing ovation. We married on June 12, 1971. I was 19 years old. I wore a dress my mother made from ivory cotton, carried a bunch of daisies from Mrs. Whitaker's garden, and stood in the front of the Maynardville Baptist Church, believing with my whole heart that I was beginning the best chapter of my life. Walter and I moved to Harlan County, Kentucky, shortly after the wedding, following the paper mill work. We rented a small house on Clover Creek Road outside of Loyal, and I set about doing what women did, making a home. I planted my first garden that summer, tomatoes, green beans, a few rows of marigolds along the fence because I liked the color. Walter built me a raised bed from scrap lumber he brought home from the mill. We were, by any measure I had been given, happy. Our son, James Earl, was born in March of 1973. Our daughter, Patricia Ann, came in August of 1975. By the time I was 23 years old, I had a husband, 2 children, a garden, and a house. Everything the world had told me a woman was supposed to want. And I did want it. I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about a woman who was trapped in a life she never chose. I loved my children with a fierceness that still catches me off guard when I think about it. I loved my garden. I loved cooking Sunday dinners big enough to feed half the street. These things were real, and they were mine. What I did not understand, what took me decades to see, was that none of those real and beautiful things excused what else was happening in the same house, in the same marriage, in the same life. Walter was not cruel. I want to be precise about this, because when women my age tell stories about bad marriages, people expect cruelty, raised hands, shouting, obvious violence. Walter was nothing like that. Walter was something more insidious, something harder to name, and therefore harder to fight. Walter was a withholder. He withheld information the way other men withheld affection, quietly, systematically, and always with a reasonable explanation ready if you asked. He handled the finances. He opened the mail. He managed the bank account, paid the bills, filed the taxes. When I asked questions, he answered them in ways that technically responded to what I said without actually telling me anything I needed to know. "We're fine," he would say when I asked about the savings. "Don't worry about that," when I asked about a letter from the county assessor. "I'll take care of it," for everything else. For 20 years I took "I'll take care of it" as a complete sentence and went back to my garden. Walter died on September 3, 2009. He was 63 years old, and the official cause was a massive heart attack in the parking lot of the Harlan County Courthouse, where he had gone, according to his appointment book, for what I assumed was some routine business matter. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I got the call at 11:47 in the morning while I was deadheading the roses along the back fence. I remember setting down my pruning shears very carefully on the top rail of the fence before I went inside to call James. I was 57 years old when Walter died. I had been married to him for 38 years. I stood at his graveside in October and watched them lower the casket into the ground at the Loyal Baptist Cemetery, and I felt grief, genuine, complicated grief, for the man I had loved, and for the marriage that had been exactly what it had been, no more and no less. I did not yet know what I was grieving for. I did not yet know that the man in that casket had left behind something other than memories and a jointly owned house and a modest savings account that, as I would slowly discover over the following months, was considerably less modest than I had been led to believe it was not. That discovery did not come all at once. That is the thing about secrets that are buried carefully. They don't announce themselves. They surface slowly, like stones working their way up through the soil after a long winter, appearing at the edges of things you thought you understood, catching the light just enough to make you think, for the first time in years, wait. The first stone surfaced about 6 months after Walter's funeral. I had been going through his desk, something I had avoided for months because Walter was particular about his desk, and old habits die harder than you'd think when the person who instilled them is already gone. The desk was a heavy oak roll top that had been in his family, and it stood in what he called the study, and what I called the room with all the papers. I had never gone through it while he was alive. In 38 years of marriage, I had never once opened that roll top and looked inside without his knowledge. That fact alone, I have since realized, tells you almost everything you need to know about the power arrangement in the Calloway household. What I found in the right-hand drawer of that roll-top desk, underneath a box of rubber bands and a 2004 calendar for the Harlan County Farm Bureau, was a bank book for an account at a savings institution in Knoxville that I had never heard of, in Walter's name only, with a balance as of January 2009, 8 months before his death, of $47,312. I sat in Walter's chair for a long time after I found that bank book. $47,000. In an account I didn't know existed, in a bank 60 miles away from where we lived, in his name alone. Now, I want to tell you about the moment I found that bank book, because it is important that you understand not just what I discovered, but how I responded to discovering it. Because my response tells you more about the woman I had become by age 57 than anything else in this story. I sat in that chair, and I looked at that number, and my first thought was not, he lied to me. My first thought was, there must be a good reason for this. I told myself it was probably savings he was setting aside for something. A surprise. An emergency fund. Something practical that he had simply not gotten around to telling me yet. I told myself this with the practiced ease of a woman who had been telling herself convenient things for 38 years, and then I put the bank book in my sweater pocket and went to make dinner. That night, I could not eat. That night, I lay in the bed we had shared for decades, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about $47,000 and all the things it could mean, and I chose, deliberately, consciously, with the full awareness of a woman who is making a choice she knows is wrong, to keep not knowing. Because not knowing, I had learned over a very long marriage, was far more comfortable than knowing. Not knowing meant Walter was still the man I had grieved. Knowing might mean something I wasn't ready for. That was in March of 2010. The second stone surfaced 4 months later, in July. I was sorting through a box of old papers from the attic, the kind of task that grief makes you do, that slow process of dismantling a life and deciding what stays and what goes, when I found a letter. It was in an envelope that had been opened and refolded many times, the creases worn soft as cloth. The return address was a law firm in Nashville, Tennessee. The date on the letter was August 17, 2006, 3 years before Walter died. The letter referred to a property transaction. It used language I didn't fully understand at the time. Phrases like fee simple transfer and quit claim deed. But the core of what it said was clear enough. Walter had sold a piece of property, a lot on Laurel Branch Road in Union County, Tennessee, Union County, where I grew up, where my family was from. A lot that, according to this letter, had been in the Calloway family name and had sold for $62,000. $62,000. I had never known we owned property in Union County. I had never known Walter had any connection to Union County at all, beyond the fact that he had met me there. I sat on the attic floor with that letter in my hands, and the comfortable story I had been building, the "there must be a good reason" story, developed its first visible crack. 3 months later, in October of 2010, 1 year after Walter's funeral, James came to visit. James was 37 by then, living in Knoxville with his wife Renee and their 2 kids, working in insurance. He was a good son, steady, reliable, built from the same practical material as his father without, I had always believed, his father's capacity for silence. James and I sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the way we always did, with our coffee and whatever was left of dessert. And James said something that he said carefully, and with the obvious reluctance of a man who has been holding something for a while and finally decided he can't hold it anymore. He told me he had run across some paperwork while helping a colleague with a title search. He told me the paperwork involved property in our county. He told me gently that there was a name on a deed that he hadn't expected to see. He told me the name was not mine and not his sister Patricia's. The name was Shirley Ann Beaumont. He put a folded piece of paper on the table between us. I did not pick it up for a very long time. If you're watching this right now and something about Dorothy's story is already sitting heavy in your chest, if any of this feels familiar in the way that only true things feel familiar, I want to ask you to do something small right now before we go any further. Hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it means the world to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know if you're in Tennessee, in Texas, in California, in Florida, wherever you are. Your support is the reason stories like Dorothy's get told. Now let's keep going, because this is where things start to get complicated in ways that none of us saw coming. I need to tell you about the years before the bank book and the letter and the name on the deed. I need to take you back into the body of the marriage, into the ordinary texture of the decades, because the story of how I ended up digging in my garden at 2 a.m. is not just the story of what I found. It is the story of everything I did not let myself see along the way. It is the story of a woman who was, by every external measure, paying attention, and who was, by every internal measure, choosing not to. The first signal, the first real signal, the kind that your body registers even when your mind refuses to, came in 1988. We had been married 17 years. James was 15, Patricia was 13, and we had moved from Harlan County back to Tennessee 4 years earlier, settling in a town called Bean Station on the western edge of Granger County, because Walter had taken a management position at a lumber supply company based out of Morristown. The house on Poplar Gap Road was the first house we had ever owned, a white clapboard 2-story with a deep front porch and enough backyard for the garden I had been slowly perfecting for the better part of 2 decades. I had roses along the south fence and a vegetable patch that ran the full length of the east side. I had irises and black-eyed Susans and a wisteria vine on the back trellis that bloomed every May with a scent so thick you could almost chew it. It was a Saturday in late October when Walter told me he had a conference in Nashville the following week. He would be gone Tuesday through Thursday, he said. He told me this at dinner, very matter-of-factly, the way he told me most things, as information delivered rather than a conversation invited. I said, of course that was fine. What did he need me to pack for him? He said he'd handle it himself. He already had a bag ready. I remember thinking that was slightly unusual, because packing his bag for trips was something I had always done. not because he asked me to, but because it was one of those household tasks that had quietly become mine somewhere along the way all the household tasks had. But I thought nothing more of it. He left Tuesday morning. He called Tuesday night briefly to say he had arrived. He did not call Wednesday. I told myself he was busy. Thursday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, I was standing in the kitchen cutting apples for a pie when the phone rang. It was the front desk of the Holiday Inn on West End Avenue in Nashville. A woman calling to let me know that the room Mr. Calloway had reserved had been checked out early, and to confirm the address for the return of a jacket that had been left in the closet. Mr. Calloway's room had been checked out early, that morning, not Thursday evening when he was supposed to come home. Thursday morning. I gave the woman our address for the jacket and hung up the phone and stood there at the counter with the apple still in my hand, and I felt something move through me that I did not have a name for in 1988. It was not quite suspicion. It was something more primitive, a cold animal awareness that something in the landscape was not where you left it. I stood there for about 3 minutes. Then I finished cutting the apple and made the pie. Walter came home Thursday evening exactly when he said he would. I did not ask him about checking out early. He did not volunteer it. We had dinner. I served the apple pie. James complained about his algebra homework. Patricia asked if she could go to the homecoming dance, and the evening proceeded like every other evening. I told myself there were 100 explanations for checking out of a hotel early. Meetings canceled, conference ended. He decided to drive around before coming home. Any number of things. I told myself this so convincingly that by the time I went to bed that night, I had nearly stopped thinking about the phone call at all. Nearly, but not completely. That is the thing I have had to reckon with in the years since. I never completely stopped thinking about any of it. I just became very good at pushing the thoughts to a place in my mind where they lived quietly and did not require me to act. The second signal came 2 years later, in 1990. We had just finished having the kitchen repainted, a creamy yellow that I had wanted for years, and the painter had moved the refrigerator away from the wall to protect the baseboard. When he pushed it back, he left it about 6 inches out from the wall, and I noticed that something had been taped to the back of the refrigerator up near the top, a small envelope secured with 2 strips of duct tape that had turned yellow and hard with age. I stood on a step stool and peeled it off. Inside was a folded note in Walter's handwriting. Not a letter, not anything long, just a line of numbers that looked like a telephone number, and underneath it, 2 words, Shirley, Nashville. I remember staring at that piece of paper for a long time. Shirley, Nashville. It was a phone number and a name and a city. That was all it was. I told myself it could be anything. A work contact, a business reference, someone from the lumber company's Nashville office. Shirley was a common enough name. Nashville was a large enough city. The explanation assembled itself in my mind with the efficiency of something that had been assembling itself for years, clicking into place like a key in a lock. I refolded the note. I put it back in the envelope. I retaped the envelope to the back of the refrigerator, in the same spot, with fresh tape from the junk drawer. I pushed the refrigerator back against the wall, and I stepped down from the stool, and I stood in my beautiful, newly yellow kitchen for a moment, and then I went to start dinner. Years later, when I finally told my daughter Patricia about that moment, she asked me why I put the note back, why I didn't keep it, why I didn't act on it right then, in 1990, with 20 years of marriage still ahead of me. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered her. What I finally said was this: I put it back because finding it had already cost me more than I could afford to spend. If I kept it, I would have to do something with it. And doing something with it would mean acknowledging what I suspected, and acknowledging what I suspected would mean that everything I had built, the house, the garden, the Sunday dinners, the 38 years, was something other than what I had believed it was. In 1990, I was 38 years old. I had a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old. I had no high school diploma and no marketable skills beyond the ability to run a household with extraordinary precision. I had nowhere to go and no money to get there. So I put the note back and I made dinner, and I did not say the name Shirley out loud for 19 more years. The third signal came in 1994. Walter and I drove to Knoxville in August to help James move into his first apartment. He was 21, just starting a job at an insurance company. We were loading boxes in the parking lot of his apartment complex when Walter's work pager went off. He looked at the number, and something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would have noticed. But I noticed. I had been reading Walter's face for 23 years by then, and I saw the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, the way his eyes went still for just a half second before he said, casually, that he needed to find a payphone. He walked around to the front of the building. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he said it had been the lumber company, some issue with a delivery. I nodded. James asked if everything was okay. Walter said everything was fine. Let's get these boxes upstairs. But I had been counting. 20 minutes for a delivery issue. In the parking lot of my son's first apartment in Knoxville in August 1994, I had been counting, and I had been cataloging, and I had been filing things in the place in my mind where things went when I couldn't afford to look at them directly. And somehow the file had gotten very full without my ever having officially opened it. The fourth signal was the Christmas card in 1998. Walter handled all our correspondence. This was one of those household tasks that had somehow also become his, perhaps the only administrative task he handled personally rather than delegating to me. He wrote and sent the Christmas cards to his family and work colleagues every December. I never questioned this because it seemed like one of the few domestic contributions he made reliably. But in December of 1998, a card came back to our house. Return to sender. Address changed. And because it came on a day when I got the mail before Walter did, I saw the front of the envelope before he could intercept it. It was addressed in Walter's handwriting to a Shirley Beaumont at a street address in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville. Shirley Beaumont, Nashville. Not a work contact, not a business reference. A woman who received personal Christmas cards from my husband at her home address. I held that envelope in the driveway for a long time. Long enough for the November cold to work its way through my cardigan. Long enough for me to make a decision that I have spent the last 25 years examining from every possible angle. I put the envelope in my coat pocket. I carried it inside. I put it in the back of my sock drawer, under the Christmas gift money I kept folded in a rubber band for last-minute presents. I did not say anything to Walter. When he asked if any mail had come, I said just a few catalogs and a utility bill. He nodded. The returned Christmas card stayed in my sock drawer for 11 years, until Walter died. And then I found it again, when I was sorting through my own things in the strange, disorienting process of becoming a widow, and I looked at that name, Shirley Beaumont, and I felt something I had been not feeling for a very long time finally begin to stir. The fifth signal was a conversation I was not supposed to overhear. In 2001, Walter and his old friend from the lumber company, a man named Dave Garrett, were sitting on the back porch after a cookout, and I was in the kitchen with the window screen down, but the window partially open because it was a warm September evening. I was washing dishes. I wasn't listening, particularly the way you're not listening when you're near a conversation that you expect to be boring. But then I heard Dave say something that I have never been able to fully unhear. Something he said in the quiet, flat voice that men use when they're saying something that they believe is being said privately. He said, "You ever think about what happens if she figures it out?" And Walter said, without any hesitation that I could detect, "She won't." That was all. 2 sentences. Dave said something after that which I could not make out, and then the conversation moved on to something about a baseball game. But those 2 sentences, "You ever think about what happens if she figures it out and she won't?" I stood at the kitchen sink with my hands in the soapy water, and I felt those words move through me like cold water, and I stood there for so long that the dishwater went cold around my hands, and I didn't notice. She won't. Not. There's nothing to figure out. Not. What do you mean? Not any denial or deflection, just the flat, confident certainty of a man who had accurate data about the woman he was married to. Walter knew I wouldn't figure it out because he had spent 30 years watching me choose not to. The sixth signal came in 2004, 5 years before Walter died. Patricia, who had moved to Chattanooga and was working as an administrative assistant at an engineering firm, called me one evening and mentioned, casually, the way adult children mention things they've noticed but don't quite know what to do with, that she had run into one of Walter's old colleagues at a Walmart in Chattanooga, a man she vaguely recognized from our bean station days. She said the man had asked how Walter was doing and then said something that confused her. He said, "Is he still going down to Nashville every month?" Patricia had said she wasn't sure what he meant, and the man had looked slightly uncomfortable and said something about a company branch down there, and then changed the subject. Patricia called me specifically because she thought I would know what he was talking about. I told her I thought it might be something to do with a supplier Walter had mentioned. Patricia said, "Oh, okay," and we moved on. But after I hung up the phone, I went to the calendar on the kitchen wall, the big one from the hardware store that Walter used to write his appointments on, and I flipped back through several months. And I saw it, marked in Walter's small, careful handwriting, on roughly the third Tuesday of most months, for as far back as the calendar went, Nashville. Sometimes with a time, sometimes just the word, every single month, as regularly as a bill payment or a dental appointment. I had seen those entries for years. Years. I had made note of them in the same unconscious way I made note of the garbage pickup schedule or the date of the county fair. Walter went to Nashville on business sometimes. That was the information those entries had always communicated to me, and that was the information I had always accepted. Standing at the kitchen calendar in 2004, at 52 years old, with my daughter's phone call still warm in my ear, and the returned Christmas card still in my sock drawer, and the note from behind the refrigerator still in my memory, and Dave Garrett's voice still somewhere in the back of my mind saying, "You ever think about what happens if she figures it out?" I understood. With a clarity that I had been avoiding for 16 years and that arrived finally, like a key turning in a lock, exactly what those Nashville entries meant. I understood it completely. And then I did the thing I had been doing since 1988. I closed the calendar and I went to make Walter's coffee. I am telling you this not to excuse myself and not to shame myself, but because I need you to understand the full shape of what happened over those 40 years, and the full shape requires you to see not just Walter's choices, but mine. I chose, again and again, to close the calendar. I was 61 years old and a widow and standing in my own kitchen when I finally stopped choosing that. But there were 2 more signals before that, 2 more before Walter died, and they matter. The 7th signal was the most direct, and it came in 2007. I had been reading the Morristown Gazette Mail online. This was new for me. James had set up a computer in the spare bedroom and showed me how to use it, and I was browsing through the local notices out of old habit, the way I used to read the print version. In the property transfer section, I saw a listing for a parcel on Laurel Branch Road in Maynardville, a sale recorded to one Walter E. Calloway. Our name, my husband's name, with our home address in Bean Station listed as the address of record. We owned property in Maynardville, in Union County, where I grew up. Property I had never been told about. I sat in front of that computer screen for a very long time. I thought about the note with Shirley's name. I thought about the Nashville entries on the calendar. I thought about the returned Christmas card. I thought about Dave Garrett saying she won't. I opened a new browser window and I sat there for 3 minutes. And then I typed in Shirley Beaumont, Nashville, Tennessee. And then I deleted it without hitting search. I closed the computer. I went to water my garden. The 8th signal was the last one, and it came only 3 months before Walter died in the summer of 2009. I found in the inside breast pocket of a suit jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner a receipt from a jeweler in Nashville. The date was May 2009. The item listed was a women's gold pendant necklace with an amethyst stone, the kind you might buy for someone's birthday or Mother's Day, or simply because you wanted to give something to a person you cared about. The cost was $412. I did not own a gold pendant necklace with an amethyst stone. I put the receipt in my own pocket. I took the suit jacket to the dry cleaner. I drove home. I made a sandwich. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter looking out the window at my garden, and I felt something I can only describe as a very deep, very tired sadness. Not the sharp sadness of a fresh wound, but the dull, heavy sadness of a wound you have been quietly tending for so long that you've stopped expecting it to heal. Walter died 9 weeks later on September 3, 2009, and the sadness I felt at his graveside was real. And the grief was real. And the love was real, or something that had lived in the same house as love for long enough to pass as love. And underneath all of it, in the deepest part of the drawer, was 40 years of closed calendars and put-back envelopes and deleted browser windows. 40 years of choosing not to know. James's visit in October 2010 ended that. The piece of paper he put on the kitchen table was a copy of a property deed. The property was a house, not a lot, not undeveloped land, but a house, on a street in Hermitage, a suburb of Nashville. The house had been purchased in 2003, 6 years before Walter died. It had been purchased jointly in 2 names. One was Walter Eugene Calloway, the other was Shirley Ann Beaumont. Anne, if you've stayed with me this far, if you're sitting somewhere right now and you've been listening to all of this with the particular tension in your chest that comes from watching someone finally wake up, please, right now, leave a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me if you ever had a Shirley Beaumont in your own life, because I know some of you did. Give this video a like if this story is touching something in you. You being here, listening, giving this story your attention. That is what allows this channel to keep sharing stories like Dorothy's with people who need to hear them. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after James put the paper down. He sat across from me, not speaking. Because James has always been the kind of person who understands that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone is be quiet while they process a thing that is too large and too jagged to process quickly. A house in Nashville, purchased with my husband. In 2003, when Walter and I were celebrating 32 years of marriage with a trip to Gatlinburg that he had planned and that I had thought was one of the most romantic gestures he had made in years. A house. Not an affair that existed in hotel rooms and telephone calls, though those too, clearly. A house, with her name on the deed next to his. A home. The word sat in my chest like a stone. I thought about the bankbook in the right-hand drawer of the roll-top desk. $47,312. I thought about the letter from the Nashville law firm and the $62,000 from the Laurel Branch Road property sale. I thought about the monthly Nashville entries on the calendar, stretching back as far as I had ever looked and probably further. I thought about the amethyst necklace receipt. I thought about all the Sundays. All the Sunday dinners, all the Sunday mornings in that same Baptist church where we had been married, sitting in the same pew for decades, Walter with his arm along the back of the pew behind my shoulders in the way that looks like an embrace. All the Christmases, all the vacations, all the ordinary Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings and Wednesday nights. The thousands and thousands of ordinary hours that constitute a marriage, all of them occurring simultaneously with, I now understood, an entire other life, conducted with care and precision, and apparently real estate investment. I looked at James. I asked him how long he had known. He said he had found the deed 6 weeks ago. I asked why he had waited 6 weeks to tell me. He said because he didn't know if he was doing me a kindness or a harm, and he needed time to decide. I thought about that. Then I said that I appreciated him telling me, and that I needed him to go home now. He looked uncertain. I told him I was not going to do anything dramatic. I just needed to be alone in the house for a while, and I would call him in the morning. He stood up. He hugged me. A long, careful hug. The kind you give someone who is holding themselves together by something you can't see. And then he went home. I sat at the kitchen table until it was dark. I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the increasing dark of an October evening in Bean Station, Tennessee, in a house that was paid for, that was mine by deed and by decades of maintenance. And I thought about Shirley Ann Beaumont and the house in Hermitage that also had my husband's name on the deed. And I thought about what that meant, legally, financially, practically, for me. Because here is the thing that no one tells you when you're 19 years old and standing in an ivory cotton dress in the Maynardville Baptist Church. Property law is not romantic, but it is real. A joint deed creates joint ownership. A joint owner has rights. A widow's rights in the state of Tennessee are specific and actionable. And Walter Calloway had purchased a house jointly with another woman while we were still legally married. I am not a lawyer. I had a 10th grade education and no professional credentials beyond a lifetime of careful household management. But I had been reading since I was a child who could not stop asking questions. And I had been watching and listening and storing information for 60 years. And by the time the kitchen was fully dark and I finally got up to turn on the light, I had the broad outlines of a plan. It would take me 8 months to execute. The first thing I did was find a lawyer. This was harder than it sounds because I had no money I could access independently. All our accounts were joint. And I was not yet ready for Shirley Beaumont or anyone associated with Walter's estate to know I was asking questions. James offered to pay for an initial consultation, and I accepted. I sat across from a woman named Carol Ann Whitfield at her office in Morristown, Tennessee, on a cold November morning, and I told her everything. I told her about the bankbook and the Nashville accounts. I told her about the law firm letter and the $62,000. I told her about the house in Hermitage and the joint deed and the monthly Nashville trips and the 39 years of marriage and the $47,312 in the account I hadn't known existed. Carol Ann Whitfield was 50 years old, small and precise, and she listened to all of it without expression. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, do you understand that you may have a claim against the Hermitage property?" I said I had suspected as much. She said that property purchased with marital funds during a marriage, even if titled jointly with a third party, may be subject to claims by the surviving spouse depending on the circumstances of the purchase and the source of the funds. She said that the account in Knoxville and any other accounts I could document might constitute marital property that had been diverted without my knowledge or consent. She said that this was going to require documentation. A lot of documentation. She said I needed to start gathering everything I could find. I told her I had been gathering things, in a manner of speaking, for a long time. She looked at me with a slight tilt of her head and said, "That was good. That was very good." I went home and I started going through the roll-top desk. The desk, it turned out, was a small library of the life Walter had been conducting in parallel with ours. I want you to understand that I did not find this all at once, like a dramatic discovery in a movie. I found it in pieces, over 3 weeks of systematic, quiet searching, going through every drawer, every folder, every envelope, the way you search when you are a meticulous woman who has been running a household for 40 years and knows exactly how to organize information and exactly how to find what isn't organized. I found statements for 3 bank accounts I had not known existed, in 2 different banks, 1 in Knoxville and 2 in Nashville. I found property tax receipts for the Hermitage house going back to 2003. I found a collection of cards, birthday, Christmas, Valentine's Day, in a bundled stack secured with a rubber band, all signed Love Shirley, going back to 1987. 1987. Walter and I had been married 16 years in 1987. James was 14. Patricia was 12. I had been making Sunday dinners and tending my garden and folding Walter's shirts and choosing not to know for 16 years before those cards began. And for all I knew, the choosing not to know had been covering something even older than 1987. Because there was no card from 1986, but that proved nothing except that he had started saving them in 1987. I photographed everything with the digital camera James had given me for Christmas 2 years earlier. I documented every account number, every statement, every receipt. I made a chronological file. I put the originals back in the desk exactly as I had found them, because Carol Ann Whitfield had told me to disturb nothing in the estate until we were ready to move. Then I started on the garden. I know that seems like a strange thing to say in the middle of an accounting of financial discovery. But you need to understand that the garden has always been, for me, the place where I think. 40 years of thinking had happened between those roses and that wisteria vine. And in the spring of 2011, while I was preparing the beds for the season, while I was turning the soil and pulling the winter kill and cutting back what had died in the cold, I was also turning over everything I now knew and thinking about what to do with it. And one evening in April of 2011, while I was clearing the old raised bed that Walter had built me in the first summer on Poplar Gap Road, the one he had made from scrap lumber, the one that had grown more tomatoes and green beans than I could count over the decades, I hit something hard under the soil. I assumed it was a stone. I dug around it. It was not a stone. It was a tin box, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in old oilcloth, rotted mostly away, buried at a depth of about 18 inches under the left rear corner of the old raised bed, in the spot where the soil was deepest and dampest and least likely to be disturbed. I pulled it out with both hands, kneeling in the dirt, and I sat back on my heels and looked at it. The latch was rusted, but it opened. Inside, wrapped in a piece of heavy plastic that had kept out most of the moisture, were documents. I am not going to tell you I knew immediately what they were, because I didn't. I carried the box to the porch, and I set it on the porch table, and I opened the plastic carefully, and I looked at what was there. There was a birth certificate, not for James or Patricia, for a child I had never heard of, a boy born on February 19, 1976, at Nashville General Hospital. The father's name on the certificate was Walter Eugene Calloway. The mother's name was Shirley Ann Beaumont. The child's name was Thomas Walter Beaumont. Walter had a son born 9 months after our daughter Patricia, in February of 1976, when we were living on Clover Creek Road in Harlan County, when I was 23 years old and nursing a 6-month-old baby and still believing with my whole heart that I was beginning the best chapter of my life. Under the birth certificate, there were letters, a stack of letters, handwritten, tied with a piece of kitchen twine. I untied them. I read them. I will not tell you what was in them in any detail, because some things deserve to stay between people even after those people are gone, and the truth of what they did is fully known. But I will tell you that those letters made the shape of everything clear, the shape of a relationship that had begun in 1971, the year Walter and I married. Shirley Beaumont had not come after our marriage. She had been there from the beginning, or nearly from the beginning. She had been, in some understanding of the word that I was not prepared for, a parallel wife, a woman who had been promised things, given things, built a life with a version of Walter Calloway that existed in Nashville while a different version existed in Maynardville and Harlan County and Bean Station. Under the letters was one more document, a life insurance policy, a separate policy, not the one I knew about, not the one that had paid out at Walter's death through the estate. A second policy, with a face value of $250,000, naming Thomas Walter Beaumont as the sole beneficiary, dated 2001. Premiums that, when I cross-referenced the dates with the bank statements I had already documented, had been paid from the Knoxville account that I had not known existed. $250,000. To a son I had not known about, funded by money that had been generated in part by 40 years of a marriage that I had been fully present for and entirely uninformed about. I sat on that porch for a very long time. The motion sensor light above the back door clicked on and then clicked off again. The wisteria on the back trellis was just beginning to open. It was mid-April, and the first clusters of purple flowers were showing at the tips of the vines, and the smell of them reached me where I sat. Sweet and slightly overwhelming, the way it had every April for as long as I could remember. I was 59 years old. My husband had been dead for a year and a half. My son was in Knoxville. My daughter was in Chattanooga. My garden was doing what it did every spring, insisting, stubbornly and beautifully, on growth. I looked at the birth certificate in my hand. Thomas Walter Beaumont, born February 19th, 1976. He would be 35 years old, and somewhere in Nashville, he had a life insurance policy with his name on it that had been funded in part with money that was also mine. I put everything back in the tin box, carefully. I brought it inside and put it in the bedroom. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I called Carol Ann Whitfield. I want to tell you about the 8 months between that April morning and the day everything finally came into the light, because those 8 months were not passive. Those 8 months were the most actively I had lived in my entire adult life. I want you to understand what it looks like when a woman who spent 40 years closing calendars and putting notes back and deleting browser searches finally decides, at 59 years old, to stop. It looks like a woman who gets up every morning at 6 and makes coffee and sits down at her kitchen table with a legal pad and writes down everything she knows and everything she still needs to find out. It looks like a woman who drives to Morristown every 2 weeks to sit across from her attorney and answer questions and learn words like dissipation of marital assets and fraudulent conveyance and constructive trust. It looks like a woman who calls her children and tells them the truth, all of it, including the parts that are hard to say and hard to hear, because she has decided that the era of carefully managed not knowing is over, and that the people who love her deserve the actual facts. Patricia took it harder than James in the beginning. Patricia cried on the phone for 20 minutes the night I told her. And then she got quiet in the way that Patricia gets quiet when she is shifting from emotion to action. And she asked me what she could do to help. I told her I needed her to be honest with me about everything she remembered from childhood. Any unusual absences of Walter's, any phone calls she had overheard, anything that had seemed strange at the time. Patricia thought for a moment, and then she said, "Do you remember the summer of 1985, when Daddy was gone for 3 weeks and he said it was a work thing and you made us help you repaint the living room to keep busy?" I said I remembered. Patricia said she had found a woman's handkerchief in the pocket of one of Daddy's suit jackets that summer, and she had put it in the trash before I could see it because she was 10 years old and she didn't know what it meant, but she knew it would make me sad. She had been 10 years old and protecting me. I held the phone for a long moment after she said that. Then I told her thank you, baby, and that none of this had been her responsibility and that I loved her. She cried again, briefly. Then she said, "What are you going to do, Mama?" I told her I was going to get what was mine. Carol Ann Whitfield filed a civil complaint in Granger County Circuit Court in December of 2011, naming the estate of Walter Eugene Calloway and asserting a spousal claim against assets that had been diverted during the marriage. The claim specifically referenced the Hermitage property, the 3 undisclosed bank accounts, the proceeds from the Union County land sale, and the life insurance policy naming Thomas Walter Beaumont. The legal argument, in simple terms, was this: Walter Calloway had used marital funds, money earned and saved during a legal marriage, to purchase property and maintain financial relationships that I, as his legal spouse, had never been informed of or consented to. Under Tennessee law, those assets, or the value of those assets, were subject to a marital claim by the surviving spouse. I want to be honest with you about something here. Filing that complaint was one of the hardest things I had ever done in my life. Not because I doubted that it was right, but because the person the complaint was filed against was dead. Walter was gone. There was no confrontation. There was no moment where I looked him in the eye and said, I found the box, I read the letters, I know about Thomas, I know about everything. That moment was never going to happen, and I had to make peace with the fact that the justice I was seeking was not going to feel like what justice looks like in the stories. It was not going to feel like a reckoning between two people. It was going to feel like paperwork. It was going to feel like a civil filing and a court date and a negotiation between attorneys. It was still worth doing. More than worth it. There was another party, of course. Shirley Ann Beaumont. She was 63 years old, I eventually learned. She lived in the Hermitage house, the house she had shared, in the manner she had shared it, with my husband for 8 years before his death. She had known about me. I knew she had known about me because the letters made this clear. She had known there was a wife. She had known we were legally married. She had known about James and Patricia. Whether she had known about the Laurel Branch Road property, or all 3 bank accounts, or the full extent of Walter's financial maneuvering, I honestly don't know. People can know partial truths and use those partial truths to construct more comfortable narratives. I have some experience with that. I did not contact Shirley Beaumont directly, before or during the legal proceedings. Carol Ann Whitfield was very clear on this point. What I knew was what the documents told me. And what the documents told me was that a woman had been living in a house with my husband's name on the deed, and that the house had been purchased using funds that included money from our marriage. Whatever Shirley Beaumont's feelings were about any of this, the legal and financial facts were the legal and financial facts. The proceedings took almost 14 months from the initial filing to the final settlement. I am not going to walk you through every step of the legal process, because much of it was, as Carol Ann had warned me, paperwork. What I will tell you is what the outcome was, because the outcome is the part of this story that I could not have imagined when I was sitting in the dark in that kitchen in October 2010, watching James put a piece of paper on the table between us. The estate settled. The Hermitage property was sold, with the proceeds divided according to a formula that the courts applied to the proportion of marital funds used in its purchase. The 3 bank accounts were included in the marital estate calculation. The Laurel Branch Road proceeds were traced and accounted for. When everything was calculated, all the diverted assets, all the undisclosed accounts, all the property that had been purchased with money generated during our legal marriage, the marital estate that had been hidden from me had a value of just over $380,000. I was awarded $192,000, almost $200,000 that was legally, documentably, factually mine. Money that had been earned and saved and invested during a 40-year marriage. Money that existed because I had kept a household running and raised 2 children and managed every domestic dimension of Walter Calloway's life, freeing him to earn and manage and divert and conceal. Money that I received not as charity and not as sympathy, but as a legal determination that what had been taken from me, without my knowledge or consent, was mine. I was 59 years old when the settlement was finalized. I had never had that much money in my life. I want to tell you about the year after the settlement, because I think people assume that when a woman in my position gets a resolution, when the legal process ends and the money is in the bank and the story has reached what should be its conclusion, that the hardest part is over. And in some ways, they're right. But in the way that matters most, the hardest part was just beginning. The hardest part was figuring out who I was without the story I had been telling about myself for 40 years. For 4 decades, the story was this: Dorothy May Calloway, wife of Walter, mother of James and Patricia, keeper of the house on Poplar Gap Road, tender of the garden. That story was not false. The motherhood was real. The garden was real. The house was real. But the story had been framed by a marriage that was itself framed by a lie I had chosen not to see. And now that I had seen it, I had to figure out how to tell a story about myself that didn't have wife of Walter as its organizing principle. This is harder than it sounds when you've been doing the opposite for 40 years. I stayed in the house on Poplar Gap Road for 1 more year after the settlement. I needed that year. I needed to be in my own garden, in my own rooms, with my own things around me while I sorted through what I was going to do next. I kept seeing Carol Ann Whitfield, not for legal matters, but because she had become, in the strange intimacy of that 14-month process, something close to a friend. A woman I trusted absolutely and who understood exactly where I had been and where I was trying to go. She recommended a therapist in Morristown named Dr. Susan Vance, and I started seeing her every 2 weeks, and those sessions were, without exaggeration, the most honest conversations I had ever had about my own life. Dr. Vance did not treat me like a victim. This was important. I had been afraid that talking about what had happened would feel like surrender, like accepting a narrative in which I was the woman who was deceived, the woman who didn't know, the woman who found out too late. Dr. Vance did not reflect that narrative back to me. What she reflected back to me, patiently and carefully over many months, was a different story. A woman who had made choices, yes, choices that in hindsight she might have made differently, but who had made those choices in the context of the options available to her, and who, when the options changed, had responded with a clarity and determination that was not the behavior of a passive victim, but of a woman who had been waiting, on some level, for the right moment. I had not been waiting consciously, but perhaps some part of me had been gathering strength for a very long time. My relationship with James deepened during this period in ways I hadn't anticipated. He came to Bean Station more often, and when he came, we talked, really talked, in the way we hadn't talked when he was growing up, because Walter's manner discouraged certain kinds of conversation. James told me things about his own marriage, his own fears, his own questions about what it meant to be faithful and present and honest with the people you love. I told him things I had never told anyone, including things I was ashamed of, the closed calendars, the put-back notes, the deleted browser searches. James listened without judgment, which is the best gift a child can give a parent. Patricia came for a long visit in the summer after the settlement, and we planted the garden together, the two of us, side by side in the dirt, putting in tomatoes and peppers and a new section of perennial flowers along the back fence. It was one of the best weeks I can remember, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I was fully present for it in a way I hadn't been fully present for things in a very long time. When you spend years managing what you're willing to see, you also spend years somewhere slightly behind yourself, slightly removed from the immediate texture of your life. That summer, with my daughter's hands in the dirt next to mine, and the smell of the earth and the warm Tennessee afternoon, and the particular satisfaction of putting something in the ground and knowing it will come back. That summer, I was there, completely there. I moved in the spring of 2013. Not far, to a smaller house in Morristown, which was closer to Carol Ann's office, and to Dr. Vance, and to a community of women I had started to find slowly, through a church group and a garden club and a widows' support group that met on Thursday evenings at the Presbyterian Church on South Cumberland Street. I sold the house on Poplar Gap Road, which I had paid off using part of the settlement, and I took the proceeds and my portion of what was left, and I bought a modest house with a deep backyard and good light on the south side, and enough room for a garden that was entirely mine. I planted the new garden that first summer with a deliberateness I can only describe as ceremonial. I chose plants I had never grown before, things I had wanted to try for years but hadn't because Walter didn't like new things in the garden, or because I had been too busy maintaining what was already established. I planted dahlias, which I had always loved. I planted a kitchen herb garden, rosemary, thyme, lavender, oregano, right off the back door where I could reach it without going far. I planted a young apple tree in the corner of the yard, knowing it would be years before it bore fruit and not minding that at all. The Thursday group, that was what we called it. Just the Thursday group became one of the most important things in my life during those years. There were 7 of us at first, and then 12, and then at its peak about 20 women, ranging in age from 53 to 81, almost all of us dealing in one way or another with the aftermath of marriages that had ended, one way or another, without our complete understanding of what they had been. Not all of them had stories like mine. Some had lost husbands to illness and were simply navigating grief. Some were divorced after long marriages and were rebuilding from the particular rubble that divorce leaves. But many of them, more than I expected, had discovered, after the fact or sometimes during, that the marriage they had been inside of was not the marriage they had thought they were inside of. We sat in folding chairs and drank coffee from a percolator that one of the women brought every week in a big thermos, and we talked. About money, about loneliness, about children who wanted to help but didn't always know how, about the strange freedom and terror of being solely responsible for your own decisions. We talked about anger, the particular anger of a woman who has discovered that her trust was misplaced, which is different from ordinary anger, which is an anger that has to find a useful shape or it will consume you. We talked about the difference between forgiving someone and excusing what they did. We talked about what it meant to start over at an age that the culture had decided was past starting. Every single one of us, I came to believe, had a closed calendar in her past. Every single one of us had had a moment, or many moments, when the available evidence had suggested one thing and we had chosen to believe another because the cost of believing the evidence was, at that moment, more than we could pay. I do not say this to excuse any of the men who had done the deceiving. What they did was wrong, and the wrongness of it does not become less wrong because the women they deceived made choices that allowed the deception to continue. Both things can be true simultaneously. What I learned in those Thursday evening conversations was that understanding your own part in a story does not make you responsible for another person's betrayal. It makes you smarter about the next chapter. I got a library card at the Morristown Public Library in the fall of 2013, and I began, at age 61, to read in the systematic and ambitious way I had always wanted to, but never had the time or space for. I read history and biographies and novels and eventually books about the law, not because I needed them professionally, but because I found that understanding how things worked made me feel more securely planted in the world. I took a class at the community college on estate planning, which was perhaps the most practical thing I had ever done in my life, and which ensured that my own will and financial arrangements were entirely clear and entirely in my control. I started writing things down. Not a diary, exactly, more like notes to myself, observations about what I was learning and how I was changing. Looking back at those notes now, what strikes me is how much of what I wrote in 2013 and 2014 sounds like someone figuring out what they believe for the first time, which I suppose is exactly what was happening. Thomas Beaumont, Walter's son, was 37 years old when the settlement was finalized. I knew about him, had known about him since I found his birth certificate in the tin box. He had, through his attorney, been a party to the estate proceedings, as the named beneficiary of the second insurance policy. We had never met. We had never spoken. I did not know what he knew about me, or what his mother had told him, or how he had understood his own origins. I thought about him sometimes. I think about him still. He is, whatever else he is, a person who was born into a situation not of his choosing, and whatever he carries from that situation, I cannot hold him responsible for it. I hope he has a good life. I genuinely do. As for Shirley Beaumont, I have nothing for her but the acknowledgement that she made her choices, and I made mine, and the courts made theirs. She still lives, as far as I know, in Nashville. I bear her no particular malice. What I feel for her mostly is a kind of distant recognition, the recognition of one woman who loved a complicated man for the other woman who also loved that same complicated man. We were both deceived in the end, though the nature of our deceptions was very different. If you've been with me all the way to here, if you've listened to this whole story from the beginning, then I want to stop for a moment and say something to you directly, from Dorothy to whoever you are, wherever you are, watching this. First, thank you. Give this video a like if this story moved you. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one. Stories of women who found their way through. Stories of lives that kept growing even after everything they thought they knew turned out to be different than they thought. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. Tell me if you have a garden too. The comments on this channel are some of the most beautiful conversations I've ever read, and they happen because of you. And your support is what makes this channel able to reach women who need to hear that they are not alone. Here is what I know now, at 71 years old, standing in a garden that is entirely mine, in a life that is entirely mine, that I could not have told you when I was 19 in that ivory cotton dress, or 38 putting a note back behind the refrigerator, or 57 standing at the graveside in October trying to understand the shape of my own grief. I know that curiosity is not a problem to be managed. I know that the Mrs. Hamricks of the world were wrong, that a girl who asks too many questions is not a difficulty but a resource, and that the only thing sadder than a curious woman is a curious woman who was taught to bury her curiosity in the same garden where she buried everything else. I know that choosing not to know is still a choice, and that it carries consequences like any other choice. I do not say this to punish the young woman I was, or the middle-aged woman I was, or any of the women in that Thursday group who closed their own calendars. I say it because understanding that it was a choice, rather than something that simply happened to me, is what gives me the power to make different choices now. Victimhood is a story you can tell about yourself that is sometimes entirely true and also entirely unhelpful. I was wronged. I was also, for a long time, an active participant in not knowing about the wrong being done to me. Both things are true. One of them is the thing I can do something about. I know that it is never too late to stop. I was 59 years old when I stopped closing the calendar. When I knelt in the dirt of my own garden and dug with my hands and pulled out what had been buried there. Some women do it at 35, and some do it at 70, and some, I know, never do it at all. And to those women I want to say, whenever you are ready, the ground is waiting. Whatever you buried in there, it has not dissolved. It is still there, cold and solid, with its edges still sharp, exactly as real as the day it was put in the earth. Dig it up. That is my message. Whatever the box is in your life, whatever the closed calendar, the put-back note, the deleted search, whenever you are ready, whenever you have enough support and enough strength and enough of whatever you need, dig it up. Because what is buried does not stay buried. It only waits. I know that a garden is not just a garden. I have known this my whole life, without quite knowing how to say it. A garden is the only place in the world where the relationship between what you put in and what you get out is honest. You plant in good faith, you tend with care. Sometimes what comes up is what you planted, and sometimes it's something else entirely. Something someone else buried before you got there, or something that blew in from somewhere you can't account for, taking root in the dark where you couldn't see it. The garden does not lie to you about what's there. It just grows what it grows, and your job is to pay attention. I am paying attention now. I have been paying attention, fiercely and without flinching, for 12 years. It turns out that paying attention, at this age, with this history, in this body that has been in the garden for more than 4 decades, is one of the most extraordinary things a person can do. My dahlias bloom every August in colors I am still amazed by. The apple tree bore fruit for the first time 3 years ago. The lavender by the back door smells exactly like what I imagined peace would smell like if peace had a scent. My name is Dorothy Mae Calloway. I am 71 years old. I grew up in Maynardville, Tennessee, the stubborn one, the one who asked too many questions, and I spent 40 years learning to quiet those questions, and then I spent the rest of my life learning to ask them again. I am still asking. I intend to keep asking for as long as I am standing in a garden somewhere with my hands in the soil and the good, honest earth telling me the truth. The box that was buried in my garden did not contain my husband's death. Walter was buried in the Loyal Baptist Cemetery, and he has been there since 2009, and I have made my peace with his grave. The box contained the other life, the evidence of it, the letters, the birth certificate, the policy, and what it proved was not that Walter had never truly died, but that a version of him I had never been allowed to see had been alive, in a garden I didn't know existed, all along. I dug it up. I am still here. And whatever is buried in your garden, whatever you have been tending around and working past and choosing not to look at directly, I promise you, with everything I have lived and learned, you can dig it up too. The dirt will still be warm, your hands will shake, the light will come on, and everything will be cold and bright and overwhelming. Dig anyway. You are stronger than whatever is in the box. You have always been stronger than whatever is in the box. You just needed to find out. Thank you for sitting with me today. Thank you for being part of this community of women, and men, too, who believe that real stories told honestly have the power to change something in the people who hear them. If this story touched you, please subscribe to this channel and ring that bell, because there are more stories coming. Stories of women who found out, who stood up, who dug up what was buried, and walked into the light with muddy hands and clear eyes. Give this video a like and leave a comment below. Tell me if you have a garden. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're going to dig up. I'll be here. Dorothy Mae Calloway, still stubborn, still asking questions. Goodbye, and God bless.